All right, so we're going to get started now. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program with Professor Liam Riordan. What should we remember about the Declaration of Independence? I'm Brenda Harrington, the adult program librarian here at the Belfast Free Library, and I want to thank you all so much for coming tonight. Tonight's talk with Liam Riordan is part of our Revolutionary Belfast series of programs that we created to commemorate America's 250th anniversary and as a way to lead up to a display of a rare copy of the Declaration of Independence, which will be in this room August 13th to 15th. I invite you to pick up a copy of our program. Can't do all this at once here. In the back, all the events are here, and the QR code on the back will get you to a place where you can sign up for a time slot to register to see the declaration, because you must sign up for a time slot to come to get in. And I won't list all the programs that are happening, but there's a lot of really good ones. So I invite you to take a program and please join us. Before we get to tonight's talk, I want to mention that next Tuesday, July 14th, we will host Belfast Area High School AP History teacher and author Charles Chip Lagerbaum for a talk titled Jonathan Lauder's Truck House, 1776 to 1779, History and Archaeology of a Revolutionary War Trading Post. Now, to introduce our speaker tonight, Liam Riordan is Department Chair in Adelaide and Alan Bird Professor of History at the University of Maine, where he has been on the faculty since 1997. He is a specialist on the American Revolution and has a book project about loyalists, those who opposed the rebellion that created the United States. In 2020, he received the Maine Historical Society's Neal W. Allen History Award for outstanding contributions to Maine history. So won't you please join me in welcoming Liam to the Belfast Free Library?
That's fine. Thank you, Brenda. It is a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out tonight to talk a little bit about the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence in particular. That is my area of research specialty, and so these years of commemorations of round numbers that roll about are really great opportunities for me, where there's a resurgence of local interest or a greater curiosity about the distant past. And it's really a pleasure for me to be giving a lot of talks this summer, mostly at local libraries, which I think really represent the heart of a great democratic tradition in the United States. So thanks for coming out tonight. So I thought I'd begin with just some basics of the Declaration of Independence. It is usually understood as the start of the American Revolution. It has a strong association with the date July 4th, 1776. It clearly has an ongoing legacy that we feel in our present-day lives. Most Americans try to celebrate it with family gatherings, fireworks, barbecues, and picnics. This is something that most people in the United States share. And in addition to being a day of community connection and national identity, the Declaration of Independence is one of the most famous documents in U.S. history. Indeed, it is one of the most influential political statements in world history. Yet, notwithstanding this fame, the meaning of the document can be elusive, and even some basic facts about the Declaration are confusing. So I want to discuss both the events of early July 1776 and how the Declaration was understood at the time of its creation, as well as ways in which U.S. society has remembered the Declaration of Independence up to the present. And this is how I try to answer the question posed in today's title: what should we remember about the Declaration of Independence in 2026? So my plan is to speak for about 45 minutes and then turn to Q&A for as long as our interests sustain us. But before I turn to those remarks, I'd like to get some public input from all of you. I often find that if I just give a lecture, by the time I get to 45 or 50 minutes, everyone is so exhausted. They don't have the energy or they've forgotten what they came curious about. So I want to provide a little room at the start to open things up to any questions that you might have. And I thought I would start with a prompt to just sort of gauge by a show of hands how people here respond to this question. So, how would you describe the public memory of the founding fathers today? And so, when I say public memory, I'm asking you, in your opinion, how do you think American society generally evaluates, thinks of, remembers the founding fathers? And that, the founding fathers can be a stand-in for the revolution or the declaration, but maybe that's also a little bit different. Like, who do we mean by the founding fathers? And so I give you this 5-point scale, right? From one extreme of the highest possible praise and veneration, almost something sacred is venerated, to the other extreme of vilification, right? That there's just anger and cynicism and suspicion. And then these sort of groups in the middle, right? Mostly praise, a kind of even mix of praise and criticism, mostly criticism, or the other extreme of vilification. So maybe I'm going to start. I want everyone to put their hand up for one number. And so I'm going to start at the veneration side. In your opinion, is the public memory of the founding fathers in the US today mostly veneration? So that gets 3 votes. All right. And then slightly less, but still on a very positive scale, mostly praise. All right. So I'm going to say that's maybe 10 or so. Mix of praise and criticism. Wow. So I think we're kind of tied there. Mostly criticism. No one. And all vilification. No. All right. So now I like to ask that same. So we've kind of judged the overall sense of the room's perception of what does contemporary American society think of the founding fathers. And mostly it's on the positive side, right? There's a little bit of a mix, but given our 3 veneration votes and a pretty even vote between the other 2, we are tending more toward the positive side. So now I want to ask the same question, but how do you remember the founding fathers? So not your sense of the broader society, but for you, where do you stand on this continuum? So a show of hands for veneration. All right, so we've gone down, I think just 2. Mostly praise. I've learned I need to count because it was such a narrow vote. Mix of praise and criticism. 14, 15. Mostly criticism. And all vilification. None. All right. So pretty even vote there. Both our perception of other people and our own perception. And I would say that by and large, when I've been asking this question over the course of the last year when I give public talks like this, and I would say by and large, votes are quite close to where you're at, but people, I would say, tend to think that the public memory is slightly more critical, slightly more cynical than your personal opinion. A little bit more so than in this audience, which is pretty evenly split, though it has that same kind of tendency that we feel like we're a little bit more, the numbers are so tight. This audience might be a little bit more critical than their perception of the general US public. So I'm curious, is anyone interested in explaining why they took the votes that they did? Or does anyone just have a general question about the revolution that they've always wanted to ask, and we could get that on the table before I start plunge into my comments? Sure.
So I'm going to pass the mic to the people. Okay.
Thanks, Amanda.
Who had their hand up?
Okay. I just think that most people, majority of people in the United States really have no idea who the founding fathers are or that they know that much about them. Number one, people aren't that interested. I don't know why, but I'm older, so I have the time to be interested, if you know what I mean. Where when I was young and had little children and going to games and working and whatnot, it's a little bit harder to even think about these things or watch PBS or whatever, you know? So I just think it's harder now. And I think also that people are just too critical nowadays, but that's my opinion.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate that.
I think the issue is when I was a kid, in school, it was all about veneration. It was all about the founding fathers and how special they were, and it was about the apple tree, and it's all that stuff. And as I went through my years of education, and as I've read, I've reached the three, where clearly we simply know more about those folks and how human they were.
Great. Thanks. The hand.
Hi, Brenda. I read a review recently, a book review about an English aristocrat and a group in England who were just discussing many of the ideas in the Declaration about representation, equal rights, and all that. Maybe you could comment a little bit about the origin of some of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence. That would be, I think, enlightening for everybody.
Great. I will try to do that as part of my talk. And then if I don't, or if you want further elaboration, if you would remind me, well, I'll come back to that. Thanks.
I have a comment and a question. So first the question, I'm curious to know what it was that led the founding fathers, what led to the revolution here that didn't happen in Canada. And the comment is that my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is a signer. And as a child, and this kind of goes to what Jim's point was, what I heard from my grandfather is, don't talk about him, he had slaves. He was from Virginia. But also, and I only like a week ago learned that there are 2 books written about him. And I had known that his house is standing in Virginia that I've never visited, where when Cornwallis was coming up the coast, he took over my ancestor's house, and my ancestor, Thomas Nelson Jr., attacked his own house. And there were actually 2 cannonballs lodged in the wall of the house, which is currently a museum. But so, to Jim's point, what I heard as a child was a mix of praise and criticism. And yet at 71, I'm in the mostly praise category.
All right. Thank you, Valerie. Do we have time for a few more?
Sure.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that my criticism, I have mainly praised, and I think it's a wonderful document, but I think that many women have realized that we were left out completely. And I think, and so were a lot of other slaves. And I just think that as we've come to realize that, I don't have as much praise as I used to have for this document because they completely left out anybody but white males. So just my opinion.
So I really appreciate the range of remarks, and I think several of them anticipate what my, kind of closing comment is going to be, and that is really to ask, can we hold both praise and criticism in our public memory? Right? I think that, a historian, even a teacher can do that because they've got the luxury of time. But I think it's a bigger challenge for popular memory to be able to wrestle with both of those and think about those not excluding the other, but kind of in relationship to one another. So I'll circle back to that. I do take your point about a pendulum has swung, and there was a period not too long ago of extreme celebration, veneration, I would say. And I think we see this living still in the rotunda at the National Archives, where the parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence is on public display. It was built in 1952, and it is clearly intended to be a sacred space. Like the documents are set up on an altar with columns in a very church-like sort of setting. And we've swung a different way with a lot of criticism. And I think this is part of the challenge that American society faces today at the 250th, to try to understand, do we have any kind of consensus about what our relationship is to this founding moment and this document in particular that is such a key one for articulating some of our aspirations for what representative democracy should be about. One closing remark about this, and then I'm going to start my timer to make sure I don't run too long. It is interesting that this term founding fathers does not come from the revolutionary period. And it is actually first articulated by a US senator in the 19 teens. And then Warren Harding repeats it at his presidential inauguration in 1921. So that's just kind of a marker of something that we might think of as from the late 18th century, from the era of the revolution itself, but it's a concept that gets coined in the early 20th century and has now worked its way into popular memory, that it is kind of a substitute for what is the revolution, what is the Declaration, what is the founding fathers, that those are all in some ways of thinking interchangeable kind of concepts. And this kind of comes back to my point about wanting to explore a little bit tonight what was the Declaration of Independence in its context of the mid-1770s, but also thinking a little bit about our relationship to it and how that has changed over time. And, that to me is the challenge of both the challenge, but also the opportunity of historical commemoration. And just to go back to the very first comment about this sense of we've lost a connection and people don't have time. And I think something that a number of scholars, and I think journalists, public commenters have observed recently, is the difference between the bicentennial in 1976 and the semi-quincentennial in 2026. And maybe it's just the weird difference of a round number, that it's easier to celebrate more wholeheartedly if it's 200 or 300 or 400, and the 250 kind of falls in between. But it was, I think, I was 10 years old in 1976, but I have a memory of the bicentennial really being present in American society, in American popular culture, and that people could argue about their relationship to the revolution and what it meant, but it really was a part of public discourse in a way that doesn't seem quite so central in 2026. So, all right, I am going to start my timer because I don't want to go on too long, and this will help me keep to my time limit. So I want to start by looking at two very influential images that have a strong place in the popular memory of the American Revolution generally, and of the Declaration of Independence in particular. And the first of these is I think the most famous painting associated with the Declaration of Independence that was done by the artist John Trumbull. And it has a very interesting origin story. So I give 3 dates for when this painting was created. So his first effort to paint this sort of grand history picture began in 1786. And he decided that he wanted to paint all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence from life. And if he couldn't paint them from life, he wanted to look at a painting, a portrait that had been done of them while alive, and he would copy that painting. And so he traveled throughout the States. He also traveled throughout Europe to visit signers who were diplomats serving in Europe. And so, in a lot of senses, this painting was exactingly accurate, right? It really mattered to him to get the likeness of these founding fathers and their significance signing the Declaration of Independence. But in other ways, the painting is misleading. It doesn't really attempt to show a specific historic moment. It's trying to embody all of the creation of the Declaration of Independence in a single image. So while its title bears the date of July 4th, 1776, it actually shows the events of June 28th, when the committee that drafted the Declaration presented it to the Continental Congress and its president, John Hancock, sitting at the table. And we know pretty well from the minutes of the Continental Congress that the committee didn't present it all together. It probably was just presented by Thomas Jefferson. And these are small quibbles, maybe, but it is such a powerful image. It has done a lot to convey a sense of the unity of the founding fathers and the critical significance of this date of July 4th. And that composition really speaks to the moment that the painting was commissioned in 1817. So in 1817, the US Congress commissioned John Trumbull to take these smaller paintings he had done and make a much grander history painting that would be 12 foot by 18 feet to be installed in the rotunda of the US Capitol with 3 other history paintings that Trumbull was commissioned to paint that still hang in the US Capitol today. And 1817 was kind of a critical moment for the US Congress to commit to this project. The Washington, D.C. had been burned during the War of 1812. The U.S. Capitol building was being newly constructed after that destruction, after that failure in the War of 1812. So this is sort of a crucial early moment for shoring up the nation, thinking about what are our symbols of national unity. And this, of the 4 history paintings, is the most famous that eventually gets installed in 1826. So it's got this sort of interesting history, right? In the Revolutionary era itself, but also born at the turn of the post-War of 1812 period, and then installed by the Jacksonian presidency in 1826. The image has been remarkably popular. And I think the first mass-produced copy of it was done by Asher Durand, an important early 19th century American artist who made this engraving in the top right corner. This could be mass-produced, hung on people's walls, hung up in classrooms. Currier and Ives do several, many different versions, but all recognizably copies of the John Trumbull painting. During the bicentennial, when the $2 bill was issued, this was struck on as a fitting symbol to go on that currency. And of course, you can find it on coffee cups and T-shirts and any kind of other sort of popular culture of the revolution as well. So next, I want to turn to the text of the Declaration of Independence to learn more about how this document was created and what it meant at its time and what its legacy is for us today. This is the most famous and familiar image of the Declaration of Independence itself. It famously has the 56 signers iconically grouped at the bottom of the image. But this is actually an engraved facsimile that was made in 1823 for very practical reasons. So the Secretary of State in 1823, John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, John Adams, he called for this facsimile to be created because the original signed version was so badly damaged and faded by the early 1820s. So this engraving was a painstakingly accurate copy of the parchment version of the Declaration of Independence. This was created by order of Congress in mid-July, and so they had it done by someone with elegant penmanship to draw up a beautiful version on parchment. And then the signing begins on August 2nd. And it takes months and months before that signing is complete. So that image in the Trumbull image that seems to be all the signers together in the process of signing the document on July 4th, 1776, is not really an accurate depiction of the origins of the Declaration and how it came into being. In fact, the history of the signing of the document is complicated in an interesting sort of way. There are 9 delegates who were present in the Continental Congress in early July who did not sign the Declaration. There are 2 signers who didn't vote yes in support of the Declaration, but by the time the August copy is available, they decide they're going to sign then. And then maybe most curiously of all, there are 8 signers of the Declaration who were not delegates to the Continental Congress in early July. They come later, and now the copy is coming around. They say, well, why not? I'm going to add my name to it, even though I wasn't present when it was debated and discussed and signed. So this parchment version, as I said before, has been on display at the National Archives since 1952. Prior to that, the parchment version was owned by the Library of Congress. It owned the parchment version from 1921 to 1952 as part of the Cold War presentation of the United States. This sort of rotunda was created, and the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights were all put on display in that particular space. And before it was owned, so it's National Archives now, Library of Congress before that. Before 1921, the parchment version of the Declaration was just kept in the back files of the State Department. It was just thought of as a working document of the State Department and was filed away and not on public display at all. So there's a kind of interesting changing arc of how we think about our relationship to the Declaration of Independence as it moves from to different institutional locations within the US government. So this fancy parchment copy of the Declaration is important. And we would not really know this version were it not for that William Stone engraving of 1823. Right? This is an early act of preservation and commemoration. right? What we are doing in the summer of 2026, thinking about our distant relationship to this document, John Quincy Adams did on behalf of the US in the early 1820s by charging William Stone to make as exact a copy of that parchment version before it was even further gone. Were it not for this engraved copy, I think we would have a very different understanding of the Declaration of Independence. I am not so sure that we would have such a focus on the signers and the founding fathers if the only version of the Declaration we had was this one. Now, I want to look still more closely at the text of the Declaration to understand it more fully. But before we turn to the language in the Declaration, I want to look a little bit more closely at the process through which the Declaration of Independence was created. Who were the people, the institutions, the time period? And we begin to understand the Declaration of Independence by paying some attention to the Second Continental Congress. Now, I underline the second because this is already a little confusing. We think about the Declaration of Independence as the start of the American Revolution. Well, how could it be the Second Continental Congress that is doing it if it's the beginning of this political movement? So the First Continental Congress had met in the fall of 1774 in Philadelphia. It adjourned that fall and set a next meeting date of May of 75. The Second Continental Congress began in May of 75 in this building, the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. But a momentous change had occurred between the First and the Second Continental Congress. Uninterrupted war had started in April of 1775. So if you're a political historian, it's relatively easy to say the revolution starts with the Declaration of Independence. But if you're a military historian, you have every right to object pretty strongly to that idea because the war had been fought in a sustained manner since April of 75. So the politics is kind of playing catch up with the military facts on the ground as we know them. So the Second Continental Congress has already been meeting for a year before we get to the timeline that will lead most exactly to the Declaration of Independence. And again, it starts with a kind of curious moment. We sort of presume that the nation, the Continental Congress declares independence, and then the states kind of get their act together and follow along. But in fact, in May of 1776, Congress had called for colonies to make state constitutions. And many states had disposed of their colonial charters, their colonial constitutions, and had created state constitutions prior to the National Declaration of Independence. And these early state constitutions are an interesting range of technical perfunctory changes, just changing a word or two, to more wholesale changes in what the rules of the state government are going to be. And some of these early constitutions expressly say in them they are not permanent changes, that this is a new state constitution for New Hampshire and for South Carolina, but they are only in effect while the current conflict with Great Britain continues. So what I think this reminds us of is the great challenge of declaring independence. Right? This, I think, is the biggest challenge of thinking about the Declaration in particular or the revolution more generally from an American vantage point today, it seems obvious that this is going to happen. It is clearly a good decision. It is the future of modern democracy. And so, of course, everybody was on board with it. But that was not the case. There was so much disagreement that even some state constitutions are saying, this is just temporary. We are going to patch over these difficulties with our status as a colony in the empire. And once that is resolved, we will go back to the status quo before this conflict. Things heat up in the push toward independence on June 7th, when Richard Henry Lee, a very prominent Virginian, proposes that the Continental Congress should make this sharper and more comprehensive statement of independence, right? They've kind of been beaten to the punch by, I think, 6 different states already have new constitutions. Now the Continental Congress is going to catch up. Just 4 days after that proposal, the Continental Congress names a committee of 5 to draft a working document of the Declaration of Independence. So on June 11th, that committee of 5 is formed. The members all have portraits here. Roger Sherman of Connecticut on the left, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, a little bit more easily recognizable. And then Robert Livingston of New York made up this committee of 5. At the committee of first meeting, Thomas Jefferson was charged with being the lead author. He was the youngest delegate at the Continental Congress. He did not really want to serve in the Continental Congress. He was much more interested in serving in the Virginia legislature. That's where the action of politics was. But he was a delegate. He was in Philadelphia. And Adams really presses him and says, we need a Virginian to do this. You've got a really great way with words. And people don't really like me because I'm obnoxious and pushy. It's going to be much better if it comes from a young man like Jefferson. In only 17 days from the committee being named to the presentation of a draft to the entire Continental Congress, Jefferson was the lead author. I think it's fair to describe him as the author of the Declaration of Independence. However, the committee did have input. The committee changes things. There is discussion of it. And then there are significant changes when the draft comes before the Continental Congress as a whole. So the draft is presented on June 28th. There is a lot of other business before the Continental Congress, so they just sort of table it for a while. And then they turn to vote on the question of whether or not they are prepared to take this significant step. And again, it was not an easy decision, even among these patriot political leaders who are the delegates of their state to the Continental Congress. And they decide, we're not even going to look very closely at the language in the draft. Let's make sure that we're on board with declaring independence before we do the pain in the neck work of actually figuring out if we like this language or not. So the first vote is on July 1st. There's one vote for each state delegation, and there are arguments for and against. And that initial vote is 9 in favor, 2 opposed, and 2 abstentions. So Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted against. New York abstained. And Delaware had 3 delegates to the Continental Congress, but only 2 were present. And 1 voted yes and 1 voted no. So it's a pretty muddled situation, right? This is not a great sign of unity, a sense of confidence about what direction they're going. So they table the matter, return to it the next day. And in that revote, there are 12 states in favor and one still against. So New York is still not prepared. It's still abstaining, I should say. So we don't have a unanimous vote on July 2nd, but this is seen as a sufficient majority to make independence official. So July 2nd is really the critical date when the Continental Congress has crossed this line. And I want to read from a letter that, yeah, I think you need a mic though. Mic. Okay, I'll just repeat the question. Yeah.
So each colony had one vote.
Mm-hmm.
Some had one full
Delegates.
some
That's right. So
cells before they could.
yeah, or you could have divided votes within a delegation, and whatever the majority was in your delegation, that would be your state vote. Yeah. Another question in the back.
Do we know who twisted which arms in that between the 1st and the 2nd of July to get it from 9 to 12?
So we do know, but I don't know. There's been a lot of scrutiny of this, and we could figure out how those calculations are switching. I mean, I know the Delaware delegation, famously, the third person rides his horse through the night from Wilmington, and so that's how Delaware gets over the hump. You know, New York, the one holdout, is really because they know that a vast British armada is about to arrive in New York Harbor. And so they just have instructions from the New York legislature that, it would be insane to declare this right before this huge military force shows up. So those are some of the constraints. And I don't know how Pennsylvania and South Carolina make the break between the 1st and the 2nd. A good question. So John Adams is elated that this vote has passed, right? He has been one of the most adamant, one of the hardest working spokespeople in favor of independence. And so, he has such a great correspondence with his wife, Abigail. He's been in Philadelphia for months. She's been running the farm in Braintree. And so he writes her this great letter on July 3rd to describe how spectacular this moment is. And I think in kind of classic John Adams fashion, he gets it 99% right, but also completely wrong at the same time. So we've got the whole letter there, except for the first sentence. That he writes to Abigail, quote, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even although we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not." So you just get a sense of Adams' command of language, his investment in this project, his, I think, accurate prognostication that we will celebrate this with bonfires and illuminations. Of course, he's 48 hours off. He thinks July 2nd will be the date we hold fast, but that's just a technical difference. Now, from John Adams's wonderfully lofty assessment, I want to go back to the mundane process of creating the actual Declaration of Independence. The committee copy had been submitted to the full Congress on June 28th. Now, with independence approved by 12 of 13 states, the Continental Congress took up final edits to the text for 2 days. And so, as a committee of the whole, the entire Continental Congress went through the committee draft line by line, word by word, and made edits. Yeah.
So I'm in the process of working with a committee on revising policy register. It's taking us like a year. Did they have a deadline in mind that they felt like they had to meet, that they did this so quickly?
So I think they did have a sense of urgency, in part because they knew this British fleet was coming. And there is the time, this is really significant timing that they've gotten to the crossroads that they did by early July. Again, it was not an easy decision. There was a lot of disagreement and uncertainty. There was a lot of fear about what this would mean. But I think once they got to that point, they knew that they wanted to get this out as quickly as possible. So I do think they were focused and worked very hard on these 2 days. And most historians agree that the Continental Congress significantly improved the draft they got from the committee. And it's kind of interesting because it kind of flies in the face of that assumption that anything that is written, the larger group you've got writing a document, surely the worse it's going to be. You've got to accommodate more people and it just gets messy and sloppy or confusing. But most assessments have agreed that they clarify things, they shorten things, they delete some language, they improve some language. The one person who strongly disagreed with that was Thomas Jefferson. He was really furious at the changes they made to the Declaration. And I'll talk about the most significant of those in just a minute. But the final version, the final language of the Declaration is approved by the Continental Congress by the end of the day on July 4th. And this is why we celebrate the 4th, because they send their handwritten, edited copy to a Philadelphia journalist, newspaper printer named John Dunlap, and they have him set the type to create the first public copy of the Declaration of Independence. He sets that type through the night of July 4th. He prints off copies on the early morning of July 5th. And this is that Dunlap broadside copy that will be in this room in a couple of weeks because the Maine Historical Society owns one of just 26 known surviving copies of this first public copy of the Declaration of Independence. So a broadside is a single sheet of paper. This is sort of the tweet of the late 18th century. It is rapidly produced. It is inexpensive. It is meant to get the word out as quickly and as cheaply as possible. They could be posted up on the wall of a tavern. They could be read out loud in a town square. John Hancock mails them to all the governors of the states. He mails a copy to George Washington to be read before the troops. This is the rapid communication system of the late 18th century. Now, I think it's instructive to put the Dunlap broadside, the first public copy of the Declaration, up side by side with the famous version of the Declaration that we all know in our imaginations. And there are a couple of immediately noticeable differences between the two versions. So maybe most obviously is there are no signers on the Dunlap broadside. There are two names at the bottom, John Hancock as president in large font, and then smaller beneath it, Charles Thompson, the secretary of the Continental Congress, attesting that this is the language that they had agreed upon. And it turns out that the Continental Congress was a little slow to publicize who exactly were the signers of the document. They don't announce it publicly until January of 1777. And again, I think this is part of the military history and the political history intersecting with one another. Things have gone disastrously in the New York campaign for the Patriot military. It's only after the successful crossing of the Delaware and the battles of Trenton and Princeton that the first announcement of who the signers are is made. So there's something pragmatic about that not being included quite at this initial early moment. The other big difference between the two copies is in their titles. I think some of you maybe can make this out. I mean, they're both in the Congress. They both have the date July 4th. But the famous version calls this the unanimous declaration. The Dunlap version merely calls it a declaration. So something significant has changed from July 5th to August 2nd when that parchment copy gets written up. New York has shifted. It is no longer abstaining. It has joined the other 12. But I think it's also significant that it's no longer a declaration. It has already become the declaration. That not quite from the moment it was made, but within a month thereafter, it is clear that this is a critical document for the American Revolution. And if that revolution is successful, this will become a crucial document that gives us some insights into the goals and aspirations of the participants in that patriot movement. Now, the one other major difference, I think, between the two versions, and there's some small typographical, is it a comma, is it a period sort of thing. There's some technical changes, but the other notable difference, it's a little hard to tell, but in the Dunlap broadside version, the main body of the document reads out as individual lines. Whereas in the parchment version, it kind of all flows together like one block of text. And that individual line in the Dunlap version was the most important part of the Declaration of Independence in the summer of 1776. This was the language in the document that people scrutinized, cared about, talked about. What does this mean? Is that right? Do I agree? Do I not agree? The preamble, the grand idealistic language, which is what becomes the famous significance of the Declaration of Independence, is basically skipped over for the first generation. Only later is that language returned to and really made central. So here I zoom in a little bit more on just that block of text. And after the opening language, the Declaration says, you can't declare independence just because your mood has changed, right? There's got to be something really serious to lead you to this dramatic step. And so we need to submit facts to a candid world to justify our Declaration of Independence. And it comes in the form of 18 he has statements. So I don't know, you can probably make that out if you've got excellent eyesight in the front row. He has done this, he has done this, has done this. 18 he hases totals up, depending on how you count it, to 27 specific grievances against the king. The king has done these 27 abominable things, and this validates our dramatic decision to leave the British Empire and create ourselves as an independent republic. Now, the Maine Historical Society has done a nice job of digitizing their copy of the Dunlap broadside and then also providing a typed transcription so it's even easier to read. And so I took that and put a red block around kind of the famous language at the top of the document and a blue box around all of these he has statements. And they make up about 60% of the entire document. So if we really want to understand what is the body of the Declaration of Independence, we need to look closely at some specific language. And I think it does make sense to start with that incredible language that has made the Declaration a famous, transcendent expression of revolutionary idealism. The elegant preamble explains why this political statement is needed. And that gives way to, after a long first sentence, that's also a first paragraph, the second sentence is the most famous and succinct expression of American political ideals, and thus worth quoting at some length. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this is a brief and powerful expression of the fundamental premises of American nationhood. First, that all people were created equal. Second, that we have inherent natural rights that cannot be taken away from us. That government's sole purpose is to protect those rights. And that government gets its power and legitimacy from the consent of the governed. So the people are sovereign, and the people are the source of government's legitimate power. This revolutionary tradition represents the very highest ideals of American society and is a vision that has since inspired individuals resisting oppression throughout the world. This is really important. And many of these idealistic associations of the Declaration have been central to its meaning, and this is the way that the Declaration of Independence is mostly understood today. But as I mentioned before, this famous section was not so important and was not much commented upon during the 1770s and 1780s. Only as the revolutionary generation passed away in the early 19th century, first with the rise of the anti-slavery movement, and then in Abraham Lincoln's hands, especially in the Gettysburg Address, did this transcendent idealism become the core meaning of the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to turn to the person at the start who said, I want to know about these ideals and this language. You want to ask a follow-up or an aspect of this that you like to dig into more?
A lot of them were known to police Jefferson, maybe others, that all men are created equal, have to have the consent of the people to govern.
So, remember the committee writes the whole declaration in 17 days. And one of Jefferson's famous comments on what he did as an author is that he just tried to distill what everyone already knew. And so this is sort of language of the Enlightenment. And John Locke, the famous late 17th century English philosopher, big portions of this are taken directly from Locke. So it was in the air of the 18th century in certain learned circles, and it was the kind of language that someone like Jefferson was able to appropriate and translate and put in as part of this opening statement.
Was there any actual plagiarism?
Well, plagiarism did not exist in the late 18th century. That was the highest form of flattery.
Have them.
Locke's language is life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So that is much commented upon. Why does Jefferson switch from what was that well-known Lockean phrase to a pursuit of happiness instead of a pursuit of property? And I think this speaks to Jefferson's powerful command of language and a certain radical quality of Jefferson, that he did elevate the aspirations and the intention beyond what Locke's particular framing of it was. So that would be the kind of the classic example of a kind of one for one from Locke to Jefferson. Now, I want to turn from this beautiful language of the Declaration to that core section of the allegations against the king. And it would obviously be tedious to go over all 28 grievances or 27, whatever that count was. Many of them are hard to understand. Some of them are overstated or simply not true. But it builds the rhetorical theory of the 18th century as kind of the opposite of what we do today. And that is that you save your best argument for last, right? You start easy and you build to a climax, and then you really hit them hard with the thing that matters most to you. Now, the final he has condemnation in the Jefferson draft was the biggest deletion that the Continental Congress made to the draft. This is really, I think, why Jefferson is so pissed off. And I said, my most important thing, you guys have taken away. That final condemnation, that final he has statement in Jefferson's draft, condemned the king for the transatlantic slave trade and said, we're not to blame for slavery. That is on the king. And I think that his fellow members of the Continental Congress, a strong majority of whom were slave owners, along with Jefferson, just said, Tom, you have gone too far, right? This is not going to pass the straight face test. We just got to delete this one. So what becomes the penultimate he has from Jefferson becomes the final one. And it is a very disturbing final statement of what the Continental Congress believes is the most horrific abuse that the king has perpetrated that will help to ensure patriot unity. So it blames the king. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This is bald and angry and violent language. And that final 4 lines is clearly placing indigenous people outside of the fold of the patriot movement, that they are the enemy. The worst thing the king has done is to mobilize indigenous people to fight the patriot movement. And this assuredly is what will help good patriots rally together and be united in this difficult cause. Now, my time is up, but I do not want to leave on that particular aspect of the Declaration, because I think we have to remember that the Declaration of Independence is a piece of political propaganda, right? It is written with a very specific purpose. And above all, that purpose is to forge patriot unity in whatever means that you can. And so this offensive description of indigenous people does not reflect the reality of American society in the late 18th century. And so I want to shift away from the Declaration of Independence to the first treaty that recognized U.S. independence. And it's got a Maine connection that is really satisfying. So leaders of two Wabanaki tribes had traveled to Watertown, Massachusetts, to enter into conference and treaty negotiations with the Massachusetts government about the conflicts that have been fought in New England since April of 1775, while the Passamaquoddy and Micmac diplomatic corps is meeting with the Massachusetts Patriot government. News of the Declaration of Independence arrives in Watertown, Massachusetts. So the Watertown Treaty of Alliance and Friendship is signed on July 19th, 1776. It has the signatures of a number of Wabanaki diplomats. You can download a copy, a scanned copy from the Maine State Archives. And this is the first state-to-state recognition of U.S. independence. So the position of indigenous people and their relationship with settler society is a lot more complicated than the violence of that final clause of the Declaration of Independence. At the same time, Massachusetts is negotiating very hard to build an alliance with Wabanaki tribal nations to bring them in to the political and military struggle to achieve American independence. And really the critical issue becomes Penobscot tribal homelands. And the Massachusetts government in the 1770s, their treaty acknowledges that the Penobscots will control 5 miles on either side of the Penobscot River up to what we think of as Indian Island, Old Town area today. So that is a treaty that will get rolled back in the early 19th century. But in the 1770s, that was a crucial alliance for patriots in Massachusetts to weather the storm and meet the great challenge of the revolutionary struggle. So my closing comment is to wonder if we can make a place in our public memory for both the idealism, but also the violence of the American Revolution, that those are both parts of the revolutionary legacy. They are both aspects of American society that we would recognize in our contemporary culture. And they are both things that were present in the 1770s, right? There was real disagreement about when and how and even whether to commit oneself to independence. And that kind of polarization is an aspect of American history that has been with us ever since. I mean, if we look at the first centennial in 1876, that's the wake of the Civil War. That is the year of probably the most controversial presidential election in US history that is decided by the Supreme Court when the Electoral College can't resolve it. And in 2026, we are, I think, similarly embattled about who we are as a nation and what our relationship is to the revolution. So I'd welcome, if you have the energy or the interest to ask more questions, I'd love to have more of a conversation. I also want to make a plug for the summer issue of the journal Maine History that is co-published by the Maine Historical Society and the History Department at the University of Maine. It's a revolutionary commemoration issue that has articles on a common soldier from Maine, on recent archaeological work about the Margaretta, the first naval battle of the Revolution. It's got a piece about Martha Ballard, the most famous woman in Revolutionary era Maine, and also a piece about the Watertown Treaty. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention and patience. And
Thank you so much, Liam. That was wonderful. Do we have questions? All the way in the back. No, they have to be on the mic or.
for the sake of YouTube.
So I apologize because I came in late, so you may have addressed this before my arrival, but the term men are created. Do you think that that still has an argument today? And what, in your opinion or your research, did it really represent back in the 1700s?
So there is no question that there was dramatic inequality between men and women in the late 18th century. And I think Jefferson in particular does not show as a good example. The contrast would be John Adams, right? His correspondence with Abigail Adams is almost alone among the founding fathers of really being a union of minds and a partnership and an equal exchange in that letter. Very unusual. So there's that. I mentioned earlier that one of the constitutions that predates the Declaration of Independence is the New Jersey State Constitution. The language of the New Jersey State Constitution allows women with property the right to vote. And that constitution will get revised twice, and they strengthen the language. They actually make explicitly clear that he or she, worth a certain amount of property, have the right to vote. You know, there is Abigail Adams's famous letter to John saying, remember the ladies in the code of laws that you will write. All men would be tyrants if they could. So, you know, people weren't blind to this. It was out there. It was part of the radical potential of the revolution, but it clearly is capped pretty quickly. I recently learned that the first translation of the Declaration into non-English language was by a Pennsylvania German printer in Philadelphia. And the language that he used for men translates as all people. So there is some contradictory evidence. I do think that in that grand, idealistic, aspirational moment, it was intended to be all people are created equal. Even though we know the reality for women, for enslaved people, for indigenous Americans is going to fall incredibly below that standard. But it's a really important question, one that students always want to discuss, and one that I think I'm not often able to persuade my students of, because they're cynical.
Any other questions?
So the original writing that Jefferson and the committee had handwritten on parchment given to the Congress was then they put out their changes in it, including the big one at the end, which speaks to Jefferson's apparently more universal idea that this is not just for landed men, right? So all that it boggles my mind that then another handwritten piece was done. That was all accomplished within those few days. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we have the Jefferson copy.
Oh, that's what. Yeah.
That gets presented to the Continental Congress, and it's fully digitalized at I forget if it's the National Archives of the Library of Congress, but you can see it page by page, and there's a transcription of it, and it's scratched out, and words are added, and that's all the committee work. That copy goes to the Continental Congress. They then rewrite that, and they send that copy to the printer John Dunlap. That copy does not exist. So there are some arguments about the Dunlap text versus some small changes to the parchment version of August 2nd. And is there interpretive significance between them? And we do not have that literal in-between copy that undoubtedly got pitched to the floor of the printer's office and swept out and recycled and made into the next week's papers or something.
Anybody else?
This may be too much of a political statement or question. It seems the mood in the 200th anniversary and the anniversary now is very different. There's not nearly as much enthusiasm. There's much more cynicism. And a lot of it has to do with current political situation. Would you comment briefly on that?
So,
if you want to, I'm not.
I do think there's a significant difference between the commemorative activities of 1976 and 2026. There was a lot of controversy in the bicentennial commemoration. And remember, it's at the end of Vietnam, it is in the immediate wake of Watergate. And so there is all kinds of disagreement and challenge. And the federal official bicentennial commission really gets overthrown. And there are incredible allegations against it for the celebration that it was just a commercial boondoggle and they just were going to brand things and try to make money. So if you want to be optimistic about this, I would say that there was similar qualities of hucksterism. But what I think is really different is that there was a counter movement in 1976 that demanded an alternative kind of commemoration and that organized and created committees and actually had an impact at the federal level in addition to the kind of local activities and statewide activities that were carried out. And I do feel in 2026, there's more cynicism and giving up and just walking away from it rather than really trying to engage it and force some kind of other way of thinking about our relationship to the past and to the revolution.
Anybody else? I'm going to take one in the front.
I was just listening to a talk show and it just amazed me. And I just didn't know if you had any input on the ages of our forefathers during this time that this was signed. I had heard one of them was 18.
So Jefferson is the youngest delegate to the Second Continental Congress, and he was 33. So, they were prominent and well established. Jefferson was kind of a rising star, so I think not unusually young. And that's what you really get a second generation by the Constitution. Someone like Madison or Hamilton, they're, at the margins in the mid 1770s, but by the mid 1780s, late 1780s, they will come into sort of an age of political leadership.
Okay, we're going to take one more.
I'm sort of struck with the centuries that have gone by that the culminating point that they used was fear mongering.
Yeah.
And that still seems to be the motivator. And in 200 years, we still have not figured out what about Native Americans and what about prior slaves and how do they fit in?
I mean, to me, this is one of the things that makes history fascinating to me, that there are certain things in human nature that endure, one of which is the mobilizing effectiveness of fear. And we can see that as a long through line in American politics. But at the same time, things really do change. And I am actually optimistic about the state of Indigenous politics in Maine in 2026. I think I moved here in 1997, and I think it's the Wabanaki tribes have a very different place in sort of mainstream white political culture now than they did when I arrived in the state. So there's still challenges, there's still problems, there are both positive and negative aspects of human nature that endure, but I see some room for optimism. Just as a closing line, I'll remind everyone that the Maine Historical Society's Dunlap Broadside is going to tour every Maine county from July to October, and it'll be in this room at the Belfast Free Library, August 13th to 15th. I think Brenda said that some of the times to view it have already sold out. So if that is something you're interested in, you should probably check out their website and
That's
figure
right.
out
Pick up a flyer in the back. It'll get you there with the QR code. Thank you again so much, Liam, and thank you all for your engagement in this talk.